we're going to think a little bit more about what then happened. It's all very well having received the command, but now they will actually have to go and do something about it. And that's what we're going to consider in chapter 35. So we just read in verses, let's just look at verse 4 first of all. This is the thing which Yahweh commanded you, and you can see there in verse 5, an offering unto the Lord, whosoever is of a willing heart, let him bring it, an offering, and then it enumerates some of the things that would be necessary, wouldn't it? Gold and silver and brass. So the importance of being willing is underlined there, and also that they could then bring if they were willing. Interesting to note verses 6 and 10, the sorts of things they could bring, all the things that would be necessary for the building of the tabernacle, whether it be the fabric colours from verse 6, goat's hair, ram skins, badger skins, or oil for the light in verse 8, or precious stones in verse 9. So there were things that you could bring in verses 6 to 9, and then verses 10 to 19 was things you could do with those things. So verse 10 says, every wise-hearted among you shall come, and then it talks about the tabernacle and his tent. It talks about all kinds of things that you could do in order to bring about those things. And the point is made strongly when we come to verse 21. Just to get the point as we read, they came, everyone whose heart stirred him up, and everyone whose spirit made willing, and they brought Yahweh's offering to do the work of the tabernacle of the congregation. And in verse 22, as many as were willing-hearted, bracelets, earrings, rings, tablets, jewels of gold, and every man with whom was found blue and purple and scarlet. So there were things you could bring and things you could do. And the idea was that everybody was involved in some way or other. Interesting just to reflect on some of the things that we read there in verse 22, bracelets, earrings, rings, tablets, jewels of gold, because I'm sure it won't have escaped our attention if we just keep a finger here and go back to chapter 12, that many of those things had a particular source, didn't they? In chapter 12, verse 35, when they left Egypt, of course, and the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses, this is Exodus 12, verse 35, and they borrowed of the Egyptians jewels and silver, jewels of silver and jewels of gold. Of course, in the Authorized Version, it does come across very quaintly, doesn't it? Because borrowing was the very last thing they were doing. They were not going to give them back, were they? But perhaps more accurately translated, it is that they granted their requests, says verse 36. The people gave them favor such they lent them, they didn't lend them, they granted their requests and they plundered Egypt. So, of course, in the wisdom and the mercy of God, the things with which they had been blessed when they left Egypt, when they left behind the old life, when they recognized deliverance from slavery, was what God was going to bring them into the land to worship him. Well, then those things were for him, weren't they? And this event that we're reading about is the purpose in his providence and his wisdom, no doubt, that he intended them to be used for. The things which marked their deliverance from sin. It was a sign, wasn't it, of their new life and their dedication to him. That's what those things were to be used for, in his worship. The freedom that they now had was to be used to worship him. That's the story, as it is for us, my brothers and sisters, in our deliverance from the land of sin and death, and the life that God has blessed us with is in service to him, and in every aspect of it, and in every relationship of it, is to give him that glory and that praise. Now, it's in contrast then, isn't it? I'm not turning to Exodus 32, but as they came down the mountain, Moses and then Joshua as he met him, that of course, what a contrast that is, that as Moses came down and he saw the golden calf, And it says quite explicitly, doesn't it, that Aaron had said, break off the earrings that are in the ears, the gold earrings of your wives and your sons and your daughters. And those earrings had been used not for the worship and the service of God, but rather for idol worship. And it speaks powerfully to us, doesn't it, of the danger of the freedom that we enjoy. Freedom to serve God, not to serve ourselves. And that was the lesson that they had to learn from the incident with Aaron. So in chapter 35, then, going back to Exodus 35, we've seen some of the things that they brought, and they brought whatever it was they could. Those who had those garments, or the ram skins, those who had the earrings, whatever it was that they felt they wanted to bring. And now in chapter 35, verse 25, we have the second category. 35 verse 25, and all the women that were wise-hearted did spin with their hands and brought that which they had spun, both of blue and of purple and of scarlet and of fine linen. So there were clearly some clever spinners. I know some clever knitters, and I know some clever crocheters and other things of that kind. And they were there doing it, weren't they? To such an extent that that which they produced ended up in the tabernacle. I mean, I don't know if this is quite right, brothers and sisters, but it seems to me, I imagine an Auntie Nellie. I don't mean a particular Auntie Nellie. I just imagine an Auntie Nellie with a red scarf that she could bring. And it would be built into the fabric of the tabernacle. She had brought it. And when Bezalel and Aholiab led them in the making of it, it was her offering. And that which the Almighty had given from on high in the pattern that we thought about, now had been wonderfully associated with that which they in their weakness had been able to offer, because God had brought them near to him. He had sanctified them through his law and the offerings. And now that which was being constructed was being combined with that which they offered. And it's a wonderful picture, isn't it, that we in our weakness, brothers and sisters, yet can bring that which is acceptable if our heart is right to the service of God and to the building of his ecclesia. Wherever we are physically is not the point, is it? But our seeking to help others and to build up the body of Christ is our offering, just as certainly as Auntie Nellie's red scarf or any other part of the fabric that they brought. So they all brought. That was verse 25, wasn't it? Verse 26, all the women whose hearts stirred them up in wisdom spun goat's hair. And so there were those with particular aptitude, it seems, is perhaps the sense of this wisdom of which it speaks. And the rulers brought onyx stones and stones to be set for the ephod, the precious things they were giving of what they could, and the spice and the oil. And so that was the point. You brought and you did as you were able and as you had to the service of God. Just go back to verse 4 again. And Moses spake unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, this is the thing which Yahweh commanded. So we have a commandment from God in verse 4. And in verse 5 it says, whosoever is of a willing heart. Now, it's interesting because those two principles need to be set alongside each other and just thought about carefully, don't they? A command is something which, well, it's a command. It's a thou shalt, such as we've already seen. And yet a willing is a free willing, isn't it? It's a voluntary offering. That's actually the sense of the word, just as we read elsewhere in this wonderful law, which had at its heart that which they were commanded to do and the priests had to do, but there was also the provision of that which they could free will choose to do. There were voluntary offerings that they didn't have to do. was entirely up to them as to whether they were going to do it. And so he commanded that those who desired freely to do should do. But it was up to them. And it's wonderful that within then the framework of his law, he allowed for that individual response. Because here's the thing, there is one thing that the creator of the universe will not do. He will not and he cannot make us freely respond. Those two things are contradictory, aren't they? He can invite, but it is of us to freely choose to respond. That's why, isn't it? He gave Adam and Eve that wonderful choice right in the beginning to choose how they would respond. And to every other of Adam's seed, to choose to leave behind the ways and the thinking of the flesh and to follow after righteousness, to choose the ways of the Lord Jesus Christ, failingly, but nonetheless to desire to be like him. Verse 21, just see the same point, Exodus 35, verse 21. And they came, everyone whose heart stirred him up, and everyone whom his spirit made willing. It's a response, isn't it, to what God has done. He's brought them out of Egypt. He's brought them to this place. Moses explained to them, that's what I saw when I was in the mount and God gave me this vision. And we who have been delivered from Egypt now have this opportunity. And are you going to help? And the wonder of it was, and the wonderful thing was that, of course, they did. Verse 29, the children of Israel brought a willing offering unto the Lord, a free will offering, a voluntary offering, those whose heart made them willing. That's the idea of the words. And the challenge comes to me, doesn't it? And to you, my brothers and sisters. Is my heart stirred by what God has done for me? Am I remembering that I've been brought out of Egypt, that every day with which the Lord has blessed me is a day from him? For truly, whether we wake or whether we sleep, we are the Lord's. And we might sometimes feel like the apostle, that we are in a great strait. Because to be with Christ is that which we desire above all else. And yet it is necessary to continue day by day faithfully until he come, occupying until he come, and seeking to help others in that walk. Now, there is this other side. I've already mentioned this, verse 10, and I think in verse 10, where he says, every wise-hearted among you shall come and make all that the Lord has commanded. It seems to perhaps indicate there are those who have some aptitude which is more natural to spinning and others more natural to weaving. I don't think in this verse, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he's speaking here of any particular spirit-gifted ability. That seems to have been restricted to Bezalel and Aholiab. But nonetheless, they were to do what they could in their service. And provided it was done in the right way and in accordance with this pattern that had been laid down, then they could all offer in whatever way they could. And I think that translates fairly obviously to us in our own service, in our own seeking to respond to the love that God has shown to us. Of course, if we had been in Swindon, well, if we'd been in Swindon, half of you wouldn't have heard this anyway, but that's not the point. If we'd been in Swindon, then, of course, we would have been talking about what we could do in our physical building, wouldn't we? And amongst each other in our, I was going to say, our normal ways, that which the Lord has blessed us for 150 years as a body, and for 50 years, brothers and sisters, more perhaps, with great freedom and relative prosperity. We do well to remember that with which certainly the younger generation, and I count myself as one, well, I'm rapidly going over that, aren't I? But you know what I mean? We've seen, some of us at any rate, a time of peace and prosperity and restrictions that we haven't had, the previous generations have dealt with. And it does us well to remember that It is of the Lord's mercies that we share each day, and that we are to be thankful even in times of difficulty and restrictions such as we now face, that we are to be thankful for that for which the Lord has blessed us, and to seek his mercy and his strength where things do become challenging, as they have for many in this period. But I was going to say, if we've been in our normal meetings, then the call for volunteers and for help is never ending, is it? The duties that need to take place for our ordinary meetings and activities to just carry on. And of course, it's changed, hasn't it, in the last 6 months? And our activities have changed necessarily. But the principle is the same. In some ways, perhaps it's even more important that we make the effort to keep in touch and to seek to help others along that path. Well, let's come to verse 30 and consider Bezaleel and Aholiab. Because Moses said unto the children of Israel, see, Yahweh hath called by name Bezaleel the son of Uri, the son of Hur, and he's filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, and in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship. Wisdom, understanding, knowledge, workmanship. So here was a man then who was going to be specially spirit guided to fulfill the purpose for which God had for him, so that the pattern might be perfectly executed. And it's not a stretch, is it, to see a parallel between this man here who received the vision that Moses had and was charged with putting it into effect, with the words that Jesus received from his Father, he who was the way, the truth, and the life, who was the pattern, if you like, passing on to his spirit-guided apostles the words of salvation and teaching, just as we saw from Paul telling Timothy that which thou hast received commit to faithful men, that they may be able to teach others also. And this wonderful river of truth might flow down through the ages, even to us who do not have that same spirit-gifted ability, but yet can read the words and benefit from their teaching. And so that we in our faith and our worship might be encouraged and strengthened to build the house too. Verse 34, and he hath put in his heart that he may teach, both he and Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach. So Bezaleel and Aholiab have wisdom put in their heart that they might teach. That, of course, was one of the spirit-gifted roles, wasn't it, in the first century, to be teachers, that they might teach others the things of the truth, and that, as I say, the pattern might be expertly brought into being. The phrase in verse 34, the wisdom that God hath put in his heart, is reminiscent too of 1 Kings 10 verse 24. All the kings sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom that God had put in his heart, he who was charged with the responsibility. And there is a contrast. Importantly, verse 35, them hath he filled with wisdom of heart to work all the manner of work of the engraver, the cunning workman, the embroiderer in blue, and so on, even of those that do any work, and of those that devise cunning work. It was Bezaleel and Aholiab, verse 34, as I say, who it seems were given that miraculous ability. The rest were simply guided in that work by those. So it was not left to human accident or human ingenuity, but to God, who left it on record for our benefit. And so it is with the written word today. Well, let's consider Solomon then, 1 Chronicles 28, because just as in our first talk, the same pattern holds true as well when we come to think of Solomon building the temple. 1 Chronicles 28, verse 9, and this is again the words of David to Solomon. Thou, Solomon, my son, know thou the God of thy father, and serve him with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searcheth all hearts and understands all the imagination of the thoughts. So the perfect heart there, or the whole heart, the complete heart, It's actually the Hebrew word shalom, which we think of as peace, but at its heart is that which is whole or complete. That's why there is peace. This is the whole man, says Ecclesiastes. Well, that's what you've got to have, said David. The whole heart, given in service. And you've got to be willing, and here he uses an interesting word, which is to desire or to delight or to have pleasure in. So set your mind, he says to Solomon, to take pleasure in the things of God. That's, if you don't do that, you won't have a whole heart in any wise. And ironic it is, isn't it, when you think of Solomon, the way that he's later described. Now, verse 20. David said to Solomon his son, "Be strong and of good courage, for God will be with you. And behold, the courses of the priests and the Levites, even of they shall be with thee for the service of the house of God, and there shall be with thee all manner of workmanship, every willing, skillful man." And the same idea exactly, willing, as in Exodus 35, and skillful or wise. They're there with you to help you. They're willing, just as you would need. Just go over to chapter 29 and just note what David says himself. He says about how, verse 2, "I have prepared with all my might, all my power, my force and my vigour, for the house of my God, the things to be made of gold and silver and brass and iron and wood and stones." And he lists several of the things that in Exodus 35 the people brought, remember. He's like them, he's a bringer. He can't be a doer. Because in God's wisdom, it wasn't for David to do, it was for him to bring. But David didn't turn around and say, well, then I'm having no more to do with it. I wanted to build and you won't let me. He said, okay, my role is to be a bringer, not a doer in this case. There are times in life, aren't there, brothers and sisters, when we're prevented from being a doer as we would like. And our role is different for whatever reason. And we must trust in the Lord's wisdom to do whatever we can to further his work and to help others toward that kingdom. And note how beautifully in verse 3 he says, "Moreover, because I have set my affection." And what he actually is saying is, I delighted in the house of my God. He uses the word in chapter 28, verse 1, when he says willing. It's that word, to take a delight and a desire. And he says, that's what I did. I delighted in the house of God. And I have of mine own proper good, that is of my treasure. That's the idea. My personal treasure I have given. Of his own resources then, David had taken to give for the things of the house of God. And he had, as we read in Exodus 19, as God saw his people as his peculiar treasure, and of those who think upon his name in Malachi 3, he will make up his jewels, same word again. That's who God counts as his treasure. If we count his things as our treasure. And that's the challenge for us each day, isn't it? With all the distractions and the challenges to see that his things are the treasure. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels. And where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. And let it be on these things, he says, that our heart might be whole and complete with him. And so how wonderfully then, David exhorts the others to be willing, verse 5. He says at the end of the verse, verse 5, and who then is willing to consecrate his service? And he uses a different word here. The idea is, who is going to volunteer? Who of themselves is willing to offer? That's the sense of the word. As he turns to all the people, as Moses did, and said, well, which of you then is going to be willing? And the people rejoiced, verse 9. For that they offered willingly, they offered of themselves, they volunteered, because with a whole heart. Can you see these same ideas coming through? And David's faithful example is influencing them too. With an upright and a whole heart, I should say, they offered willingly to Yahweh. So here's my challenge. Is my heart spontaneously full and wholly with the Lord? And is my life given to furthering his work and his service in whatever way I can? Do I fill my life and my heart with the things of God? Just before we leave David, I should say, just notice in verses 10 to 14, he makes a beautiful point here that he wants the people to remember. He blessed them in verse 10 and he says, verse 11, thine, O Yahweh, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heaven and earth is thine. Both riches and honour come of thee, and thine hand is power and might. And in thine hand it is to make great and to give strength. And looking for the end of verse 14, and of thine own have we given thee. So he says, well, it's all come from God anyway. We're just giving back to him what he's given to us. And that's true, isn't it? In whatever sense, whatever form our service takes, it's ultimately true. Well, just before we finish, brothers and sisters, I want to go to the New Testament just to see how the principles are taken through beautifully in the worship of the New Testament. Remember how when the apostle spoke to the Corinthians in chapters 8 and 9, he was anxious to remind them. Let's just go to one verse there, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where he's dealing with the collections for the saints and those who in Macedonia were poor, and how they had shared the truth with others. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 3, he says, for to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power, they were willing of themselves. Can you see the idea? They were voluntarily, spontaneously responding to a need, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift. Verse 11 and 12, now therefore, he says to the Corinthians, perform the doing of it, as there was a readiness to will, an eagerness, you were, Corinthians, ready to take up that collection, well then now do it. For if there be first a willing, a ready, and eager mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not that a man hath not. God is not unjust. He does not expect us to give that which we do not have or are not able to give, but rather that we do give in our service, in whatever form and whatever way, what we can for him, and he will bless it. Or we might think of Paul's wonderful letter to the Philemon, to Philemon, where he says, well, I'm asking you to receive back Onesimus, although I could command you. And I do not say to thee that you owe me your own life besides. I've preached to you the truth, he says to Philemon, so you owe your life to me. If Onesimus stole something, well, put that on my account. I'll repay it. But actually you owe everything anyway. And sometimes in the challenges of life, we forget the big picture and our true dependence on God and our need for forgiveness ourselves, that we might be ready in forgiving others. And I want to finish with the Lord. Matthew 26. So here is our Lord in the garden. And he who has already desired to eat the Passover, he desired above all things, strong word that's used there. We come to Matthew 26, verse 37. Here he is in Gethsemane. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be sorrowful and very heavy, to be full of grief and distress, to be heavy and full of heaviness. This is the idea that those words convey. Verse 38, then he saith to them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. He's grieved all around, intensely sad. And he went a little further, verse 39, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. If there is any other way than that he should go through that experience which he's about to, then he pleads that he might be so. Nevertheless, not as I will, not as my choice, my desire, my pleasure is, that's the sense of the word, but thine. So here it is, there's God's will and his own desire, and he sets aside his own that he might do his Father's. Verse 42, he went away again the second time and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done." And those were not the first time he'd uttered those words, was it? Our Father, which art in heaven. Does he not say, thy will be done, thy kingdom come? Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Thy will be done. And in this case, the only way that the kingdom could come and that the Lord could bring out of the earth a people for him was that he might go through the agony and the horror of the crucifixion that lay before him. And so he subsumed his own will to that of his Father's and chose to do it and prayed, verse 44, the third time. He left them and went away and prayed the third time, saying the same words. I don't know, brothers and sisters, whether to make too much of this, but isn't it interesting that in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when the apostle thought of his own challenges and his own weakness and the thorn in his flesh, and he says, I besought of the Lord thrice, 3 times. And the Lord said, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in brackets your weakness. The apostle could have made a good case for saying, Lord, whatever the thorn was, we won't worry about that for now. I could be a much more effective preacher, if only. And I besought the Lord 3 times. But the Lord, who prayed 3 times and left it, said, my grace is sufficient for thee. Enough to trust that the Lord knew best. Enough to believe and trust the Lord still knows best. And those difficulties and challenges through which we pass, my brothers and sisters, the Lord still knows. For if we are experiencing them, then at the very least, he has allowed them to happen. At the very least. Sometimes things happen because we cause them. Sometimes they happen for some other reason of which we have no control many times. And they are things that we do not enjoy, experiences we would not choose, and yet the Father allows them because he knows best. And he invites us to trust him as a loving Father, that he might lead us through, that we might learn to trust not in ourselves, but in he who raises the dead. Because if he can do that, brothers and sisters, he can do anything. Truly then, Jesus said to his disciples, if any man will desire to come after me, let him deny himself. Final reference, Psalm 110. Because there is a future picture, isn't there? There is a temple to be built. There is a body of believers the Lord is assembling. There is a people who are being assembled for the Lord, a seed who he shall see. For he shall see the travail of his soul, and he shall be satisfied. And it is these people of whom he speaks in Psalm 110, the most oft-quoted psalm, isn't it, in the New Testament? For Yahweh said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand, until the day comes when the Lord leaves the throne on high and returns, and the trumpet call goes out, and we are gathered, brothers and sisters, and the knock comes at the door. However it happens, we will know, won't we? Quite sure we shall know. Whenever the immortal and the almighty broke into the mundane and the everyday in Scripture, that they knew, apart from when angels caught them unawares, it is true. But we shall know at any rate and be taken to meet with him, I'm sure. Verse 2, and Yahweh shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. Here is the king who's now going to be ruling. And when thy judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants thereof shall learn righteousness. And look at verse 3. Thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. Oh yes, brothers and sisters, not just willing, but as the sense of the word really is, they shall be free will offerings. And those who by God's grace are to be in that number have, through the experiences and the difficulties and the challenges of their lives, sought to be free will offerings for him. They will fail, of course we will, through the weakness of the flesh, but our desire is to be with him and to be a free will offering for him in the development of that work. And when he returns, to be made one with him in that work. From the womb of the morning, the resurrection morning, newly born to new life with him, never again to age or to die, free from temptation and sin, when tears shall be done away, and all shall give praise and glory to the Father. This is the promise, brothers and sisters. He holds it out to us. The things through which we pass, the challenges and the restrictions we face are but the proof that the day is at hand, that the Saviour is at the door. Now is the day to show our willingness for him. Now is not the day to give up. For now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed, that when the Lord comes, we might be found watching and waiting, when the pattern of that temple is seen not only in vision, but in reality, when the people of God are gathered together for him. May we be found willing and watching and waiting, that by his grace we might be with him.